Good evening, and welcome. Tonight we embark on a gentle journey, drifting back through the quiet currents of time, to an era when the vast, uncharted stretches of the American continent held secrets untold and mysteries waiting patiently to be discovered. We'll explore a story that, despite the centuries that have passed, continues to whisper its questions across the waters and through the rustling leaves of ancient trees, the enduring tale of the lost colony of Roanoke. Imagine, if you will, the soft glow of twilight, the distant sound of waves upon a shore, as we begin to unfold this quiet narrative, allowing the gentle rhythm of the story to guide you towards a tranquil and restful slumber. Our story, or at least the central part of its enduring mystery, begins as the 16th century was drawing to a close, a time of grand ambition and perilous voyages across the vast, unpredictable Atlantic Ocean. It was then that a man named John White, an artist whose meticulous hand had so beautifully captured the New World's flora and fauna, once again found himself gazing out at the endless horizon, returning to a place that held both profound hope and growing trepidation. His destination was the island of Roanoke, a slender strip of land nestled along the southeastern coast of North America, an outpost in what was then a newly claimed English territory. On this very island, just 3 years prior, White had played a pivotal role in establishing an English colony, a hopeful seed planted in foreign soil. Now he was journeying back, prepared to resume his duties as the governor, carrying with him the weight of responsibility for the lives he had left behind and the aspirations of an entire nation. The transatlantic voyage itself was a formidable undertaking, a testament to the courage and perhaps the desperation of those who dared to cross such immense distances in relatively small, vulnerable vessels. The days melted into weeks, each one a relentless succession of rolling waves, the vastness of the ocean stretching endlessly in every direction. The sun would rise and set in a brilliant display of colors, only to be followed by nights of profound darkness, lit by an unfamiliar canopy of stars. It was a journey of endurance, of constant vigilance against the temperamental sea, and of a quiet, persistent hope for the sight of land. Finally, after what must have felt like an eternity, the first whispers of the coast appeared, a faint line on the horizon that gradually sharpened into the familiar outline of the Outer Banks. John White and his crew had arrived, but the relief and anticipation that must have swelled in their hearts was soon to be replaced by a chilling silence. As White and his men finally reached the site of the colony on Roanoke Island, a profound stillness hung in the air. The bustling activity, the sounds of building, the laughter of children, the voices of over 100 men, women, and children he had left behind, all were gone. The settlement stood empty, an eerie testament to a sudden and inexplicable departure. There was no struggle visible, no signs of a dramatic conflict, just an unsettling void. Among the quiet desolation, one of the few clues left behind was a secret message, carved with deliberate intent into the bark of a sturdy tree. This single, silent inscription was a slender thread in a tapestry of bewildering absence. Before White had the opportunity to organize a more extensive search, to truly grapple with the silent questions that the abandoned settlement posed, the dictates of the sea and the demands of the journey meant that the ship had to return to England. And so in its wake it left a mystery, one that would echo through history and continue to fascinate and puzzle us centuries later. What indeed happened to the lost colony of Roanoke? To truly appreciate the depth and complexity of this mystery, to understand the quiet circumstances that led to this profound disappearance, we must first trace our steps back in time, to the very beginning of England's ambitious venture into the New World. The story doesn't start with the lost colony itself, but rather with the careful, deliberate preparations that preceded it, unfolding in the year 1584, It was in this year that two English ships, laden with hope and curiosity, set sail across the vast expanse of the Atlantic. Their mission was not yet to establish a permanent presence, but rather to scout, to explore, and to identify a suitable location for planting what would eventually become the first enduring English colony in America. Imagine these early explorers, their vessels navigating unknown waters, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of land. In mid-July, after weeks at sea, they finally made landfall, not on a vast continental shore, but upon a delicate string of barrier islands, thin strips of sand and vegetation, protecting the mainland from the ocean's raw power. These were the Outer Banks, a landscape shaped by wind and wave, offering both shelter and challenge. Here the English quickly, and perhaps surprisingly, developed friendly relations with the local Native American inhabitants. There was an initial exchange of curiosity and goodwill, a tentative reaching out across cultures. Soon the English visitors found themselves invited to the Native American village, nestled on the very island that would later become synonymous with mystery, Roanoke Island. For about a month, this initial scouting expedition immersed itself in the new surroundings. They observed, they charted, they undoubtedly marveled at the richness of the land and the customs of its people. They gathered valuable information, not just about the geography and resources, but also about the intricate social dynamics of the indigenous tribes. With their mission accomplished, or at least a significant part of it, the expedition returned to their ships and by late September had sailed back to England. The return of these ships, bearing tales of a verdant land and amiable encounters, sparked immense excitement back home. The man in charge of this ambitious enterprise was Sir Walter Raleigh, a figure of significant influence and ambition in Elizabethan England. Upon the expedition's successful return, Raleigh immediately recognized the potential and wasted no time. He began comprehensive preparations to plant a permanent colony, a true English foothold, somewhere along the promising stretches of the Outer Banks. His vision was grand, his commitment clear. So impressed was Queen Elizabeth I by Raleigh's initiative and the promise of this new territory that she soon thereafter knighted him, bestowing upon him a title befitting his emerging status. In a gesture of honor and homage to the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth, the newly claimed land stretching vaguely inland from the coastal discoveries, was to be named Virginia. The stage was thus set for a grand undertaking, a colonial endeavor that carried the hopes of England. The spring of 1585 saw the next significant chapter unfold. A fleet of 7 ships, a formidable sight on the English coast, departed with a complement of roughly 600 men. These vessels were not merely transporting people, they were laden with enough provisions, tools, and supplies to sustain the nascent colony for approximately a year. The journey was long, as all such journeys were, but they eventually reached the Outer Banks toward the end of June. However, this promising arrival was almost immediately overshadowed by a significant crisis, a harsh reminder of the unforgiving nature of these new lands. The waters of the Outer Banks, as any seasoned sailor will attest, can be notoriously treacherous. Shifting sands, shallow inlets, and sudden shoals make navigation a perilous endeavor. A fact sadly underscored by the many shipwrecks that dot these coastlines, depicted even in the earliest maps and drawings. It was precisely this peril that confronted Raleigh's fleet. As their flagship, a vessel crucial to the entire expedition attempted to pass through one of the shallow inlets. It struck a shoal. The jarring impact, the sudden grinding halt, threatened to tear the ship apart, and it was nearly destroyed. This was no minor mishap. The flagship, as fate would have it, carried the bulk of the provisions intended for the new colony. Now much of these vital supplies were spoiled by seawater, rendered useless, a devastating blow before the colony had even truly begun. The scope of the entire colonial venture had to be dramatically, painfully reduced. Instead of the larger complement of settlers initially intended, only about 100 men were ultimately stationed on Roanoke Island. This was a significant reduction, a harbinger of the challenges that lay ahead. With the cautious approval of the local Native Americans, these men began the laborious construction of what was to become the Roanoke colony. The island itself, though, was not chosen for its agricultural bounty or its ease of access. Rather, its primary appeal lay in its strategic value. Its location offered quick access to the vast ocean, a vital connection to England, while simultaneously providing a degree of invisibility, shielding the fledgling colony from the ever-present threat of Spanish patrols. You see, Spain had already extensively colonized and laid claim to much of what the English now ambitiously called Virginia. Therefore, it was imperative for these early English settlers to be exceedingly careful, to move with discretion, and to avoid attracting any unwanted attention from their powerful and jealous rivals. A second wave of supplies and reinforcements, a crucial lifeline, was eagerly anticipated, expected to arrive before the harsh realities of winter set in. This promise of resupply was a cornerstone of the colony's initial plans, a source of quiet reassurance. However, unbeknownst to the colonists, a cruel twist of fate had intervened across the ocean. Back in England, the Queen, facing more pressing concerns of state and the escalating threat of war with Spain, had countermanded the resupply mission. The needs of a distant colony, however vital they seemed to those on Roanoke, were momentarily eclipsed by the greater geopolitical struggles of the time. As a result, as the precious provisions from the initial voyage dwindled and eventually ran out, the colonists found themselves in a precarious position. They had to rely on the generosity of the native population for their sustenance. This was a deeply uncomfortable and ultimately unsustainable dependency. While the natives initially shared what they had, their own resources were finite. They possessed only so much to spare, and they struggled with increasing difficulty to meet the burgeoning and insistent demands of the growing English settlement. This overdependence, a quiet but potent force, began to strain the delicate relationship that had initially bloomed between the two peoples. Meanwhile, a more insidious and disturbing trend began to manifest itself, a silent terror that the Native Americans were increasingly attributing to the English. Every time the English visited a Native American village, a pattern emerged. Many of its inhabitants would inexplicably collapse, seized by a mysterious illness, and then tragically, they would die. The indigenous people, witnessing this devastating and baffling phenomenon, began to form a terrifying conclusion. They believed the English possessed a deadly supernatural power, an ability to kill from a distance by shooting invisible bullets. This was their interpretation of a calamity they could not comprehend. What they had no way of knowing at the time, however, was the true tragic nature of this unseen enemy. The English, unwittingly, were carrying deadly pathogens, diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza, to which the Native Americans, having had no prior exposure, lacked any natural immunity. And so, a devastating epidemic, a silent and indiscriminate killer, was unleashed upon the indigenous population, decimating villages and shattering their communities, all without a single visible weapon being drawn. This confluence of events, diminishing food supplies, growing dependency, and the terrifying silent spread of disease, inevitably led to a profound erosion of trust. The two leaders, back on Roanoke, colonial governor Ralph Lane and the powerful Indian chieftain Wingina, found their relationship increasingly poisoned by suspicion and fear. Cohabitation, once possible, became an unbearable tension. Wingina, perhaps sensing the growing danger to his people, or simply unable to sustain the demands, made a decisive move. He decided to remove his people from the island, retreating to a larger, more secure village located on the mainland. hoping to create a safe distance from the perplexing and increasingly demanding English presence. Meanwhile, Governor Lane, perhaps consumed by paranoia, or perhaps genuinely discerning a real threat in the shifting loyalties around him, came to believe that Wingina had formed a powerful alliance with other tribes. He convinced himself that they were actively plotting to launch a coordinated attack against the English colony. Whether his fears were truly justified by intelligence, or were merely a manifestation of the intense stress and isolation of the situation, Lane decided he could not wait to find out. He chose to take preemptive action, a decision that would prove both brutal and fateful. On the first day of June in the year 1586, Lane and his men, armed and resolute, made their way to the mainland village where Wingina and his people had sought refuge. What followed was a stark and tragic display of colonial violence. The English descended upon the village and massacred its people. In the chaos and brutality, one of the Englishmen pursued Wingina himself, eventually cornering him and brutally decapitating him. The chieftain's head, a grim trophy, was later impaled outside the fort of the English colony on Roanoke, a chilling message delivered in the most visceral way, intended to instill fear and demonstrate dominance. This act severed any remaining hope of peaceful coexistence and indelibly marked the English as aggressive, dangerous invaders in the eyes of many indigenous communities. Just a week after this brutal event, a new sight appeared on the horizon, a large English fleet, its sails billowing, making its way toward the Outer Banks. This was not the long-awaited resupply mission, however, but rather the formidable fleet, commanded by the renowned sea captain, Sir Francis Drake. Drake was on his way back to England after a successful piratical expedition against Spanish interests in the Caribbean, and he had decided to make a stop at the fledgling Roanoke colony. The timing for the desperate colonists was providential, though the circumstances were grim. Given the acute lack of food that continued to plague the settlement, the recent violent clashes with the Native Americans that had shattered any pretense of peace, and the overall miserable conditions, a difficult but clear decision was made. The colony had to be abandoned. There was simply no viable path forward for the settlers to sustain themselves, let alone thrive, in such a hostile and resource-depleted environment. The colonists were hastily evacuated off the island, a hurried departure, leaving behind the structures they had so laboriously built, and the hopes they had carried with them across the ocean. After 9 long, arduous months in the New World, the surviving settlers all returned home to England, their dreams of a permanent English presence in Virginia momentarily deferred. All, that is, except for 3 men. In the confusion and haste of the evacuation, perhaps due to being away from the main settlement, or simply lost in the sudden flurry of activity, these 3 individuals were not located in time for the departure. The fleet, unwilling or unable to delay further, sailed away, leaving them behind on the desolate island. They were never heard from again, becoming the first quiet casualties of Roanoke's unfolding mystery. If the initial scouting expedition of 1584 had been hailed as a resounding success, full of promise and optimism, then the first attempt at colonization in 1585 was, in stark contrast, a categorical failure. The promising relations with the Native Americans had completely collapsed, shattered by mistrust, disease, and violence. The severe lack of food had made daily life miserable, a constant struggle against hunger and scarcity. Furthermore, one of the key motivations for the venture, the quest for wealth, had also proved fruitless. They had failed to track down any rumored sources of gold or copper, which could have made the entire costly enterprise worthwhile in the eyes of its investors. Despite this litany of failures, this catalogue of hardships and disappointments, at least one man remained undeterred, his spirit unbroken, and his determination intact. His name, as you now know, was John White. White was more than just a governor. He was an artist and a painter by trade, a man of keen observation and meticulous detail. It is to his extraordinary talent that we owe many of the surviving maps and sketches from these early voyages, the visual records that bring this period to life, the intricate depictions of the landscape, the delicate renderings of indigenous peoples and their customs, the detailed charts of coastlines. Many of these were either drawn by his own hand or are based directly on his foundational work. Somewhat ironically, given his profound contribution to our visual understanding of this era, there are no surviving portraits of White himself. His face, the features of the man who gazed upon and painstakingly recorded so much of the nascent American wilderness, remains a mystery to us, much like the colony he helped to found. White's participation in these earlier voyages, particularly in the very first scouting expedition of 1584, is slightly ambiguous in historical records. He may well have been part of that initial discovery voyage, his artistic eye already at work capturing the wonders of this new world. However, his presence on the voyage in 1585, the one that established the ill-fated first colony, is definitively recorded. What remains a bit unclear, a subtle historical nuance, is whether he stayed behind at the colony with the other settlers, living among them through the hardships, or if he returned to England with the outbound fleet once the initial settlement was established. For instance, White's name is conspicuously absent from a surviving list of all the colonists who remained. Yet, some historians believe this is merely an oversight, a clerical omission, and that he was, in fact, an integral part of that struggling community, enduring its trials alongside the others. Regardless of these finer historical points, John White's unwavering belief in the potential of the New World and his quiet persistence eventually proved influential. Sir Walter Raleigh, despite the previous costly failure, was eventually persuaded by White and a few other advocates to attempt a second venture. This next undertaking was conceived with a fundamentally different philosophy. Unlike the first colony, which had been primarily military in nature, essentially functioning as an armed outpost, this second attempt was envisioned as a true civil settlement. Crucially, it would include women and children, a clear signal of intent to establish a permanent self-sustaining community, rather than a temporary military base. Among those prepared to embark on this hopeful new journey was White's own pregnant daughter, Eleanor Dare, a deeply personal connection that underscored his commitment. Securing the necessary funding for such a grand and risky enterprise was a long and arduous struggle, a constant test of patience and persuasion. But finally, against considerable odds, the resources were gathered. In the late spring of 1587, a fleet of 3 ships, smaller than the first, but perhaps carrying even greater hope, departed England. John White was not merely an artist on this voyage. He was appointed the governor of the new colony, carrying the profound responsibility of its success or failure squarely upon his shoulders. The misfortune that seemed to cling to the first Roanoke colony did not entirely dissipate with its evacuation in 1586. In a cruel twist of fate, only days after Drake's fleet had carried the desperate colonists back to England, a ship filled with provisions, sent by Sir Walter Raleigh, finally arrived at the Outer Banks. This was the delayed resupply mission that the first colonists had so desperately awaited, now arriving to an empty shore. The crew spent a considerable amount of time searching, painstakingly combing the deserted settlement, but they found no sign of the colonists. Tragically, they also found no trace of the 3 men who had been inadvertently left behind. With no one to resupply, and no signs of life, they eventually turned their sails and returned home, their mission unfulfilled. The same disheartening scenario repeated itself just 2 weeks later. An English-bound fleet, loaded with crucial supplies and reinforcements intended for the existing colony, also discovered the settlement deserted, a silent testament to absence. However, unwilling to leave the English claim entirely vacant, the captain of this fleet made a decisive, instead, the second colony was planned for a far more promising location, somewhere along the expansive and inviting coast of Chesapeake Bay. This choice made a great deal more sense from a logistical and strategic perspective. The waters of Chesapeake Bay were significantly deeper, allowing for easier access for larger, ocean-going ships, and they were not nearly as precarious and unforgiving as those around the Outer Banks. There was ample open space, vast tracts of land for cultivation and expansion. The soil was reputed to be far more fertile, promising abundant harvests to feed a growing population. All around it seemed a marked improvement, a rational and well-considered alternative to the troubled history of Roanoke Island. Yet, as often happens in the volatile world of maritime exploration, the best-laid plans of men can be subject to the whims and agendas of others. The fleet's Portuguese navigator, Simão Fernandes, a man of considerable experience and a crucial figure in these transatlantic crossings, had other plans entirely. Fernandes had served as the navigator on the two previous expeditions, bringing his expertise to bear on the treacherous waters of the Atlantic. He was, by all accounts, a far more experienced and formidable sailor than John White, despite White's official title as governor. So, even though White held the ultimate authority on paper, it seems much of the crew, perhaps respecting Fernandes's unmatched navigational skills and his commanding presence, quietly deferred to his judgment. As such, when Fernandes made the unilateral decision to completely ignore the carefully crafted plan about Chesapeake Bay, and instead simply dump the bewildered colonists on Roanoke Island, White found himself in a difficult, perhaps impossible, position. He did nothing, or at least nothing effective, to challenge Fernandes's unexpected and fateful decision. The rest of the crew, likely seeing the navigator's unyielding resolve, quickly fell in line, and soon enough, everyone disembarked for Roanoke, a place already fraught with past failures and new dangers. Upon reaching the abandoned site of the first colony, the unsettling silence once again descended. There was no sign of the 15 crewmen they had specifically come to assist. The structures were still there but empty, and instead of living men, they found a gruesome discovery, a pile of human bones. These appeared to be the remains of one of the unfortunate men left behind. White, his heart sinking, immediately suspected the men had been attacked by vengeful Native Americans, their anger still simmering from the massacre of Wingina and his people. Any doubts he might have harbored about this grim assessment were soon to be unequivocally erased. After only a few days of trying to establish a new settlement on the island, a colonist named George Howe ventured out. His exploration was cut short by a brutal attack from a group of natives. He was pelted with no fewer than 16 arrows, a barrage that would have been instantly fatal, before his skull was caved in with the blunt force of a wooden club. It was a brutal, merciless, and unmistakable message. The English were no longer welcome on Roanoke. This was not merely an act of isolated violence, it was a stark declaration of hostility, a clear warning echoing through the quiet groves of the island. Even so, the colonists were not entirely without allies in this increasingly dangerous landscape. You see, when the initial scouting expedition returned to England in 1584, 2 Native American men had been brought along with them. Their names were Wanchese and Manteo. Wanchese hailed from Roanoke itself, while Manteo came from a neighboring village located on the island of Croatoan, a short distance to the south. Their time in England, an experience that must have been utterly disorienting and yet profoundly illuminating, shaped their perceptions of the English people in vastly different ways. As soon as they made landfall back in North America, In 1585, upon the return of the first colonial fleet, Juan Chase, perhaps having witnessed aspects of English society that fueled his resentment, returned to Roanoke with nothing but a deep-seated suspicion and animosity for these foreign invaders. He saw them as a threat to his people and their way of life. Manteo, on the other hand, had developed a profound fascination with everything the English had to offer. He was captivated by their technology, their customs, and perhaps saw opportunities for mutual benefit. He became a trusted guide, an invaluable interpreter, and a crucial mediator of sorts, working tirelessly to smooth out relations upon first contact, often bridging the vast cultural chasm between the newcomers and the indigenous inhabitants. So, in the grim aftermath of George Howe's brutal death, John White, remembering Manteo's loyalty, reached out to the Croatoans, Manteo's people. The Croatoans confirmed White's initial terrible suspicion. A large coalition of Indian tribes had indeed attacked the 15 crewmen stationed on Roanoke, a coordinated act of retaliation and defense. This coalition, they revealed, was spearheaded by none other than Juan Chase, the Roanoke native who had returned from England with such bitterness. At least 2 of the crewmen, the Croatoans reported, had been killed in the surprise attack, while the remainder, the lucky few, had managed to escape in a small boat, vanishing into the vast coastal waters, never to be seen again. The message was now unequivocal. Roanoke had become a profoundly dangerous and untenable place for the English to live. The dreams of a peaceful, thriving settlement here were fading fast. Simão Fernandes, the Portuguese navigator who had so summarily decided the colony's location, remained anchored near the Outer Banks for approximately a month. His ships, a constant reminder of the precariousness of their situation, provided a fleeting sense of security. In the meantime, as the days turned into weeks, the colonists on Roanoke grew increasingly concerned about the long-term survival of their fragile settlement. The challenges were immense: the scarcity of resources, the deepening hostility of the native tribes, and the sheer isolation. If the colony were ever to become truly self-sufficient, to endure beyond the initial provisions, they argued with growing urgency, they would require more people, more skilled laborers, and most critically, more food. It was in this atmosphere of quiet desperation and urgent necessity that they implored Governor White to return to England with Fernandes. His mission, they pleaded, would be to bring back vital supplies, to gather more settlers, and to restock the struggling colony with everything it needed to survive. White was, understandably, initially hesitant to leave. The thought of abandoning his post, of returning to England alone while his people struggled, weighed heavily on him. He feared he would be accused of desertion, a serious charge that could ruin his reputation and career. Not to mention the profound personal agony of having to abandon his daughter, Eleanor, who had recently given birth to a daughter of her own, little Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World, on this remote, increasingly precarious island. The emotional burden of such a decision must have been immense. But in time, swayed by the desperate pleas of the colonists, and perhaps recognizing the undeniable logic of their arguments for the colony's long-term survival, he was persuaded to go. It was a decision made with a heavy heart, a sacrifice for the greater good of the struggling settlement, and so, as the fleet departed in late August of 1587, its sails catching the wind, carrying John White away from Roanoke and his beloved family, he could not have known, in that quiet moment, that he would never see any of them again. The ships vanished over the horizon, leaving behind a silence, a profound and lasting mystery. The journey back to England for John White was once again a long and difficult one, filled with the usual perils of the sea. But upon his return he found a country utterly transformed, a nation gripped by fear and mobilized for war. England was no longer the relatively stable realm he had left. It was now a country teetering on the brink of an existential struggle. The threat of Spanish invasion, personified by the formidable Spanish Armada, loomed large, dominating all aspects of national life and policy. By direct orders of the Queen, a strict embargo was put in place. No ships were to leave England until the immediate threat of this powerful invasion had decisively passed. This pronouncement, however necessary for national defense, was catastrophic news for John White. His heart must have sunk weighted by the knowledge of his daughter, his granddaughter, and all the colonists he had left behind, waiting for him. Despite his best, most fervent efforts, despite his urgent pleas and desperate attempts to secure passage, he remained trapped in England. The passage of days stretched into weeks, then months, and finally into 3 long, agonizing years. He could do nothing but wait, while across the vast ocean, the fate of his colony hung precariously in the balance. It was not until the spring of 1590, after the immediate Spanish threat had been neutralized, and England could once again cautiously resume its maritime activities, that White finally managed to secure passage, with the crucial help of Sir Walter Raleigh, who still held a proprietary interest in the Virginia venture. White booked a spot on a convoy bound for America. The hope must have been immense, yet tinged with a deep, abiding fear of what he might find. Upon reaching the familiar waters of the Outer Banks in mid-August, a sight appeared that briefly rekindled a spark of hope in White's weary heart. Plumes of smoke, distinct against the distant sky, appeared to emanate from Roanoke Island. It was a sign of life, a potential beacon in the desolation. 2 boats were quickly dispatched from the convoy, rowing purposefully towards the island, their occupants eager to investigate. As they approached, the ship's cannons were fired, their booming echoes sent across the water, a desperate attempt to make their presence known, to signal their arrival to whoever might be on the shore. The men in the small boats could clearly see a great fire burning as they neared the island, but White, in his later accounts, never explicitly clarified whether this fire was a natural occurrence, perhaps a lightning strike, or a wildfire, or if it had been deliberately lit by people, a signal in response to their own. The uncertainty, even in this small detail, adds to the layer of quiet suspense. Once ashore, the search party made their way to the west end of the island. There they found a set of footprints. They appeared fresh, a tangible sign of recent human presence, yet there was no trace of those to whom they belonged. The island remained eerily silent, offering no welcoming sounds, no shouts of recognition. The search party then headed north, their footsteps crunching softly on the sand, their eyes scanning for any clue, any sign of their lost people. It was then that they happened upon a sturdy tree. Carved into its bark, stark against the weathered wood, were 3 letters, CRO, a partial message, yet a crucial one. Continuing their somber exploration, they eventually reached the entrance of what had once been the colony itself. Here they made a second, even more significant discovery, engraved deeply into a substantial wooden post, one of many that now formed a defensive barrier around the perimeter of the former settlement, was a full word Croatoan. The post itself was part of a hastily erected, perhaps defensive, palisade, a silent testimony to the colonists' preparations. The colony itself was deserted, a ghostly array of silent spaces. It was clear that it had been abandoned for some considerable time, given the pervasive overgrowth of tall grass and weeds that now reclaimed the cleared ground, gently obscuring the paths and foundations. The houses which had once sheltered families had been carefully taken down. This was not the work of raiders or a sudden disaster. It was an organized dismantling, the timbers and materials likely salvaged and moved. The colonists, it seemed, had carefully stripped the structures of any valuable or useful items they could transport. All that remained scattered among the encroaching vegetation were some bars of iron, a few discarded cannons, and 5 chests, now looted and empty, standing as silent witnesses to their removal. There was no trace whatsoever of the roughly 115 colonists, no sign of their belongings, nor of the small boats that had been left in their possession, which would have been vital for any journey. As far as anyone could tell, from the profound silence and the subtle evidence of a planned departure, no one had lived here for quite some time. The mystery, far from being solved, had only deepened. The story of the lost colony, when recounted through the lens of popular imagination, often centers dramatically around these 2 engravings, the partial Saro and the complete Croatoan, and without the full context, without the quiet background understanding of the agreement made before White's departure, it's easy to see how an author might imbue these cryptic inscriptions with immense intrigue, layering them with an almost supernatural mystery. In truth, however, from the perspective of John White himself, these carvings were some of the more well-understood elements of the entire perplexing story. At least, John White harbored no doubts about their profound and hopeful meaning. White patiently explains in his meticulously kept notes that before he left Roanoke in 1587, he and the colonists had come to a very specific and crucial agreement. It was a contingency plan, born of foresight and the understanding that his return might be delayed. If for any reason they decided or were forced to abandon the colony before the governor's return, they were to leave behind a secret token, a clear and unambiguous sign indicating their intended destination. Furthermore, if this abandonment was forced upon them, if it was an act of distress or hostile compulsion, they were specifically instructed to include a cross carved visibly alongside their chosen destination, to signify the dire circumstances of their departure. Because no such cross had been found etched into the wooden post or the tree, White was filled with a quiet yet profound confidence. He believed with an artist's clarity of vision and a father's desperate hope that the colonists had safely, and of their own accord, relocated to the island of Croatoan. It was a rational deduction based on a pre-arranged plan, offering a glimmer of hope in the vast uncertainty. Thus, White, with a renewed sense of purpose, swiftly returned to his ship, eager to pursue this vital lead. He convinced the captain, who must have been weary of the delays, to immediately set course for Croatoan, the probable refuge of his family and his people. But the cruel hand of fate, or perhaps simply the relentless power of the sea, intervened once more. While the crew prepared for departure, a sudden, powerful gust of wind, or perhaps the cumulative strain of the long voyage, caused the anchor cable to snap with a jarring sound. Without a spare anchor, an essential piece of equipment for safely navigating the treacherous coastal waters, the captain felt it was far too dangerous to continue the journey to Croatoan. The risk of losing the ship, and potentially all lives aboard, was simply too great. And so, in a moment of quiet, crushing despair, the journey was aborted. In the end, John White never made it to Croatoan. That fateful decision, forced by the sea and the lack of equipment, marked the last time he ever ventured across the vast Atlantic. His quest, so close to a potential answer, was left tragically unfinished. While this constitutes an undeniably unsatisfying conclusion to his personal search, it seemed, at the time, relatively safe to assume that the lost colony of Roanoke had simply relocated to the island of Croatoan. Case closed. Well, not quite. The narrative of history, much like the human heart, often harbors deeper complexities and lingering questions. You see, while explaining the straightforward meaning of the inscriptions, the Croatoan, without a cross signifying a safe, intentional relocation, White himself, with a single, seemingly innocuous sentence, revealed another interesting, yet profoundly puzzling detail. Before he had departed in 1587, he quietly mentioned the colonists were also preparing to move 50 miles into the mainland. This seemingly minor piece of information introduces a subtle but significant ripple of doubt into White's otherwise confident interpretation of events. While Croatoan Island is indeed located approximately 50 miles south of Roanoke, it is distinctly and unequivocally an island. It is not part of the mainland. As such, this lone sentence, a brief aside in White's careful records, introduces, if but a modicum of doubt, to his version of events. It raises a quiet, persistent question. Was Croatoan truly their only intended destination after all? If not, if the mainland was also a consideration, or perhaps even the primary destination, then where, exactly, could they have gone? The mystery, far from being solved, began to subtly shift its contours, revealing a deeper layer of complexity beneath the surface of the obvious. 2 decades after the quiet disappearance of the Roanoke colony, the long, weary Anglo-Spanish War finally came to its end, bringing a measure of peace, however fragile, back to England. With the passage of time, figures like John White, whose extraordinary efforts had been overshadowed by the larger national conflict, gradually faded into obscurity, their personal narratives becoming footnotes in the grander sweep of history. Sir Walter Raleigh, the ambitious patron of the Roanoke ventures, suffered an even more precipitous fall. He was found guilty of treason, accused of conspiring against the crown, a convoluted and dramatic episode entirely distinct from our Roanoke story, but one that further highlights the perilous political landscape of the era. Nevertheless, renewed interest in the promising lands of America began to stir once more. This resurging ambition saw the planting of a third English colony in 1607, a venture that would, against considerable odds, ultimately succeed and become the enduring settlement of Jamestown. This new Jamestown colony was established within the expansive borders of a vast and powerful confederacy of Native American tribes, all ruled by a man the English called Powhatan, a formidable and influential chieftain. One day Powhatan, whose power was absolute within his domain, captured a man who would eventually become the future governor of the Jamestown colony, a renowned figure by the name of John Smith. During Smith's captivity, Powhatan shared intriguing tales, whispering of a place where men wearing European clothing, much like Smith himself, lived. It was a tantalizing hint, a potential echo of the lost colonists, heard from the very heart of the indigenous world. Then, after his eventual release in 1608, John Smith, ever the cartographer and observer, drew a rough map of Virginia, carefully noting the locations of various tribes and landmarks. And on this map there is one particular notation, a subtle inscription marking the rumored location of these mysterious European-clad men. Unfortunately, this fascinating claim, and other similar whispers that circulated through the early years of Jamestown, were never properly investigated. The English were too preoccupied with their own survival, too focused on establishing their own foothold. So we can never definitively know if this was anything more than a fleeting rumor, a ghost of a tale that might have offered a crucial lead. Another unconfirmed report, equally tantalizing and equally frustrating in its lack of concrete evidence, suggested a far more Other reports that filtered through the early colonial settlements were equally compelling, yet difficult to verify. There were sightings, recounted by various individuals, of Native American children exhibiting unusually pale skin and, even more strikingly, blonde hair. Such observations naturally led many to suspect, with a thrill of hopeful recognition, that these children could be the direct descendants of the lost English colonists, evidence of their quiet integration into indigenous society. What these early European observers had no way of knowing at the time, however, was a subtle, but important biological fact. Albinism, a genetic condition causing a lack of pigment in skin and hair, is in fact far more prevalent among Native American populations than it is among Europeans. Thus, what appeared to be a direct link to the lost colonists could simply have been a natural, albeit visually striking, genetic trait within the indigenous communities. The hope once again remained tantalizingly out of reach of concrete proof. A more solid, and perhaps more enduring, lead emerged a full century later, adding a new layer to the quiet mystery. In 1701, the English explorer John Lawson made contact with a Native American tribe known as the Hatteras. These Hatteras people occupied the very same land, the very same geographical space as the Croatoans, Manteo's people, who had been allies of the English a century earlier. The island itself had undergone a transformation over the decades. It was now much larger and known as Hatteras Island, having been altered by the powerful forces of nature after a storm had closed one of the inlets, subtly reshaping the coastline. The Hatteras people, when speaking to Lawson, shared a fascinating oral tradition, a quiet echo from their past. They explained to him that some of their ancestors long ago had been white, and remarkably had been able to read a clear and distinct reference to the literate English colonists. Furthermore, Lawson observed several members of the Hatteras tribe possessed gray eyes, a striking and unusual trait that, according to Lawson's own observations, was unique to the Hatteras people in that region. They also spoke, with a reverence perhaps mixed with a touch of wonder, of a local legend, a spectral tale about a ghost ship, which they referred to as Sir Walter Raleigh's ship, a vessel that occasionally appeared off their shores, a phantom of the past. Hearing all these convergent details, the ancestral memory of white, literate forebears, the distinctive grey eyes, and the persistent legend of Raleigh's ghost ship, Lawson grew profoundly convinced. He believed, with the quiet conviction of an explorer piecing together ancient clues, that the Hatteras people were, in fact, the direct descendants of the lost colony of Roanoke. Much like John White before him, Lawson believed that the colony, facing inevitable hardship and seeking refuge, had been relocated to Croatoan, and that over the course of the intervening century, the two peoples, English and Native American, had intermarried, adapted, and gradually become one, their distinct cultures merging into a new, unique heritage. Okay, so now, quietly unfolding across the vast canvas of history, we have two distinct sources, separated by over a century, arguing for essentially the same version of events. John White, the original governor, tells us they went to Croatoan, based on the silent message of the carvings and the absence of the distress symbol. John Lawson, a century later, tells us they went to Croatoan, based on the evocative details of grey eyes and local legends of ancestors who were white and able to read. Perhaps not the most decisive or irrefutable evidence in a modern forensic sense, but it does, without a doubt, make for a compelling and resonating argument, weaving together fragments of a story across the generations. Following Lawson's intriguing encounter with the Hatteras people in 1701, centuries passed in relative historical quietude. Nothing of significant import, no dramatic new revelations concerning the lost colony, would be uncovered for a very long time. The mystery, like a patient, sleeping giant, lay dormant, largely undisturbed by new archaeological digs or documentary discoveries. That is, until the late 1930s, a period that saw a sudden dramatic resurgence of interest in the Roanoke enigma, brought about by a series of peculiar and highly controversial stone artifacts. These stones had been inscribed with messages supposedly written by Eleanor Dare, John White's daughter and Virginia Dare's mother, offering a heart-wrenching account of the colony's tragic fate. Unfortunately, after careful scrutiny and extensive analysis, the vast majority of these Dare stones were conclusively determined to be elaborate fakes, a clever hoax designed to capitalize on the enduring public fascination with the mystery. Well, all except for the very first stone discovered, whose authenticity remains shrouded in doubt, continuing to divide experts to this day. This particular stone features a poignant message, purportedly from Eleanor Dare, addressed to her father, John White. In its silent inscription, it describes the tragic death of her husband and child, a deeply personal and heartbreaking account. The composition of this stone, a type of metamorphic rock, made it particularly well suited for inscribing a message, its surface holding a clear mark. However, this very characteristic also made it a poor choice for a forger attempting to create a believable antique. A hoaxer would have had to chemically age any fresh markings to meticulously match the weathered surface of a centuries-old stone. While not entirely impossible, achieving such a convincing effect in the 1930s, with the scientific tools available at the time, would have been extraordinarily difficult and technically challenging. On the other hand, a substantial cloud of suspicion hangs over its discovery. The man who supposedly found the stone, the pivotal witness to its unearthing, mysteriously vanished shortly after his claim, never to be heard from again. Furthermore, the precise location of its discovery, crucial for archaeological context, was conveniently kept secret, a detail that immediately raises red flags for any serious investigation. The credibility of the writing itself, the specific style and phrasing, is equally contested among historical linguists and epigraphers. There is simply no consensus on what to make of it, leaving the first Dare stone in a persistent state of unsettling ambiguity, a quiet puzzle within a larger enigma. Modern archaeological research, too, despite its meticulous methods and advanced technologies, has been plagued by similar uncertainties and tantalizingly ambiguous results. Excavations conducted on Roanoke Island itself have mostly served to confirm the presence of a 16th century English colony, unearthing foundations and artifacts consistent with the period. However, these discoveries have done little in the way of definitively determining its ultimate fate, merely reaffirming its existence rather than explaining its disappearance. Meanwhile, archaeological digs on Hatteras Island, the ancestral land of the Hatteras tribe, and the assumed location of Croatoan have yielded a fascinating mix of Native American and European artifacts. These include fragments of pottery, glass beads, and even the hilt of a light sword, pieces of the past that hint at interaction and coexistence. But much like the findings on Roanoke, nothing that has been unearthed can be definitively, unequivocally linked to the specific, identifiable individuals of the lost colony. The evidence points to an English presence and interaction, but the smoking gun, the undeniable proof of direct connection to White's lost colonists, remains elusive. To make matters even worse, much of the crucial evidence that might one day solve this enduring mystery may now be irrevocably lost to time and the elements. Centuries of shifting sands, relentless coastal erosion, and the gradual encroachment of the sea have undoubtedly altered the landscape, potentially burying or washing away vital archaeological sites, rendering them inaccessible or entirely destroyed. It was partially out of a growing frustration for this persistent lack of definitive progress, for the tantalizing but inconclusive nature of the existing evidence, that researchers made a truly remarkable discovery in late 2011, a revelation that subtly reshaped the entire scope of the mystery. While meticulously inspecting one of John White's original hand-drawn maps of Virginia, a document of immense historical value, a keen-eyed member of the First Colony Foundation took careful note of several small patches on the map's surface. Historically, patches like these were often used by cartographers to correct minor mistakes, to amend a line, or to update a geographical detail. For centuries, No one had ever given these particular patches a second thought, assuming them to be routine revisions. This time, however, someone did. That careful observer, driven by an intuition or perhaps simply a fresh perspective, requested that the patches be carefully and scientifically examined. Underneath the lower patch, they found precisely what one would expect: minor corrections to the geographical lines and labels, subtle amendments to the existing map. But underneath the upper patch, the discovery was profoundly different and infinitely more intriguing. There, subtly hidden beneath the layer of paper, they found a symbol, clearly discernible, a four-pointed star. This particular symbol is a typical and widely recognized representation of a fort, a fortification, or a planned stronghold. A comparable symbol, confirming this cartographic convention, can be seen clearly on another map from the early 17th century, reinforcing its meaning. Further analysis revealed even more compelling details. The paint used to draw this hidden fort symbol perfectly matched the paint used elsewhere on White's map, including the very corrections drawn on top of the lower patch. This strong chemical and artistic consistency suggested, with considerable force, that the hidden fort symbol was drawn and then subsequently concealed by White himself, the original cartographer, indicating a deliberate act of hidden information. More puzzling still, adding another layer to this quiet enigma, a slightly smaller four-pointed star, enclosed by two concentric squares, had been painted with invisible ink directly on top of the patch. This subtle symbol, a ghost of an image, can even be faintly discerned with the naked eye under the right lighting conditions, meaning it had been hiding in plain sight for centuries, a silent whisper on the map, waiting to be rediscovered. Finally, and perhaps most crucially, this hidden fort is situated on the mainland, approximately 50 miles west of Roanoke Island. This geographical detail resonated profoundly with White's earlier, perplexing mention of the colonists preparing to move 50 miles into the mainland. The location of this concealed fort was quickly, and perhaps aptly, named Site X, a reference to the iconic expression, "X marks the spot." While the fort itself has yet to be definitively found, indeed, presuming it was ever fully built, archaeological digs conducted at Site X have already uncovered a few tantalizing items of interest. Fragments of 16th century pottery, bits of worked metal, and other small artifacts are indicative of an English presence in that precise area. But much like the findings on Hatteras Island, an indisputable categorical link to the lost colony has yet to be established. The evidence is suggestive, compelling even, but not yet conclusive. That being said, the research at Site X is still very much ongoing, a patient and methodical pursuit of answers. And who knows, the smoking gun, the undeniable piece of evidence that could finally solve the mystery, whatever form it may take, will perhaps have been found by the time you are quietly listening to this story. The hope for discovery remains. Presuming that this hidden symbol truly marks the intended location for the city of Raleigh, the grander vision for the second colony, one has to wonder, why was it so deliberately concealed with a patch? Why hide such a significant detail on a map? While it may be tempting to envision some elaborate, intricate conspiracy, perhaps involving spies and shadowy figures, there is a very simple and historically quite plausible explanation. Recall how, in 1608, John Smith, the famous Jamestown leader, sent his rough map of Virginia back to England. Well, the map we often see today is not the original document. It is, in fact, an illicit copy, a secret reproduction. This copy was made surreptitiously by the Spanish ambassador in London and covertly passed along to the King of Spain, a prized piece of intelligence. This incident underscores a very real and present danger for England. They had extremely good reason to worry about sensitive information, such as the precise location of a strategically important fort in the New World, being intercepted by enemy spies. In an age of intense geopolitical rivalry, such information could mean the difference between colonial success and devastating failure. Another example of this deliberate policy of concealment is how the first colony on Roanoke itself was, to some extent, hidden through omission. We still do not know the precise location or the exact layout of that initial colony, simply because it was never clearly indicated on any of the surviving English maps. While this secrecy has certainly become a source of considerable aggravation for modern historians and archaeologists, creating persistent challenges in their research, it did serve a very clear and vital purpose at the time. It successfully prevented Spain, England's primary rival for control of the New World, from ever finding the colony. In fact, Spanish forces continued to search for the English settlement long after it was, to all intents and purposes, lost to the English themselves. This persistent Spanish search makes it highly unlikely that they had anything to do with its ultimate disappearance, as they would have surely claimed the conquest and reported their findings. On the other hand, if the fort at Site X was never actually built, if the plans never came to fruition on the ground, then the patch may be precisely what it was always assumed to be by earlier scholars. Nothing more than a simple correction, an alteration to an outdated or changed plan. Then again, the presence of that near-invisible symbol, carefully drawn with invisible ink directly on top of the patch, strongly implies a deliberate act of concealment, suggesting a deeper purpose than a mere revision. It whispers of secrets, of information intended for those who knew how to look beyond the obvious. After patiently sifting through all the available evidence, after quietly considering the various theories and disparate clues, here is what seems to me the most plausible, the most gently compelling, overarching narrative. When John White left Roanoke in 1587, and when he subsequently failed to return due to the war in England, the colony, facing mounting difficulties, diminishing supplies, increasing hostility from some native tribes, and perhaps most crucially, a severe drought that is known to have gripped the region shortly after White's departure, impacting water sources and crop production, was compelled to act. It seems likely that the colony did not remain as a single vulnerable entity. Instead, it may have split into two groups, a pragmatic decision born of necessity and the desperate hope of increasing their chances of survival. One group, adhering to the original, if somewhat covert, plan, perhaps decamped for Site X, the location marked on White's map, seeking a more secure and fertile inland location. The other group, remembering the bonds of alliance and seeking safety among those who had proven friendly, went to live with the friendly Croatoans on Hatteras Island, awaiting the governor's return in a more secure and provisioned environment. As the years slowly turned into decades, as the hope of White's return gradually faded into legend, the colonists, in both potential locations, would have faced the fundamental human imperative to survive, to build new lives. Inevitably, they would have started families with, and thus become over generations, inseparable from the indigenous people amongst whom they lived. They would have adopted new customs, learned new languages, and gradually, their distinct English identity would have merged with that of their hosts. Not only would this quiet, adaptive integration explain the profound and complete disappearance of the colony, leaving no trace of English bodies or conflict, but it would also elegantly explain the Croatoan inscription, a clear signal to White of their destination among allies. It would also explain White's puzzling mention of the colonists preparing to move 50 miles into the mainland, pointing towards Site X as another potential destination. And beautifully, it would account for the distinctive grey eyes observed by John Lawson among the Hatteras, a genetic trait passed down through generations of intermarriage. While I am still leaning towards the Dare stone being a fabricated artifact, I do find it interesting, a quiet coincidence, how that stone was supposedly discovered just a few miles north of Site X. After all, if you were a hoaxer in the 1930s, attempting to convince a nation that your stone was genuine, why would you claim you found it so far away from Roanoke, the obvious location, unless perhaps that location had some hidden significance that only later became apparent? One should also always keep in mind that much of the evidence we have for this story, especially from the earliest years, relies solely on the words, the observations, and the paintings of one single man, John White. Parts of White's account, therefore, could easily be a misinterpretation of events, or perhaps even an unintentional exaggeration, seen through the lens of his own hopes and fears. So, depending on what evidence you regard as most credible, what fragments of the past resonate most strongly with you, other solutions, other quiet possibilities, are equally plausible, equally deserving of contemplation. For instance, some scholars still believe that the colony went ahead with the original plan, the one before Fernandez intervened, and relocated somewhere along the vast welcoming coast of Chesapeake Bay. Others believe with a sense of tragic inevitability that they were all lost at sea, perhaps swallowed by a sudden storm after a desperate and failed attempt to return to England themselves. But these solutions, while possible, are about as helpful in our search as simply saying the colony vanished into thin air. Without a more localized, specific place of interest to focus our efforts, to search for corroborating archaeological evidence, there is virtually no hope of a definitive resolution. The vastness of the sea, or the boundless expanse of the American wilderness, simply offers too many hiding places. So with all that being quietly said, many questions, small and large, known and unknown, continue to remain, echoing softly through the centuries. What, for instance, happened to the 3 forsaken colonists left behind by Drake's fleet, and the 13 crewmen abandoned by the second resupply ship? Their fates are entirely unknown. Why did Simão Fernandes, the experienced navigator, so willfully disobey orders and summarily dump the colonists on Roanoke Island, derailing the careful plans for Chesapeake Bay? Was it simple insubordination, or something more? Why was one of the 2 crucial engravings, the CRO on the tree, left incomplete, a partial whisper that never fully formed its message? And why, indeed, was everyone in this story named John? A quiet jest, perhaps, to lighten the gravity of such profound questions. As for the most important question of all, the one that continues to draw us back